Hello everyone, my name is Adam Michael Anthony Simpson and you're watching my YouTube channel, Adam M.A. Simpson. This is part 2 of my interview featuring Dr. Anja Brandon and Dr. Nicole Xu. Stay tuned. And so now I wanted to get into both of your research, which involved animals. Anja with mealworms and Nicole with jellyfish. Could either of you discuss what your PhD research entailed and why studying these, animals and what they can do was so important for society and science and
Yeah, Anja, why don't you go first?
Waiting to be directed, or do we need to rock paper scissors?
Rock paper scissors. We should have done that. Yeah. Go ahead, Anja.
Okay, so my research for my PhD focused on solutions for plastic waste and plastic waste management. Plastic pollution is obviously a global crisis. And so we were looking for ways that we can break down plastics, especially plastics that are, notoriously cause a lot of pollution and cannot be recycled. So there's not great alternatives for them. And so we discovered that mealworms, which are this common insect, can eat and actually break down plastics like polystyrene or a styrofoam cup and polyethylene, which is basically the material of a shopping bag. And fully break it down. So not just make it into smaller bits of plastic like microplastics, really degrade it and get rid of the plastics itself. So then it fell on me for the rest of my PhD to figure out how these mealworms were capable of doing that. And specifically, after we learned a little bit more, how the bacteria in their gut were capable of doing this degradation and how we could use that knowledge to try to scale it up in some sort of engineered vessel or system that we could use as a viable alternative for plastic waste. Obviously plastic is dealing with plastic is obviously really important right now, as it has been for a while. And coming up with ways that are cheaper and more sustainable, like recycling or landfilling, is really important. So the long-term goal of that project still is going on, is to try to figure out, with some of these plastics that we don't have other alternatives for, can we recover something of value from them, or at the very least get rid of some of the problematic pieces.
Love that. Thanks for that.
A bridge. And that's so interesting.
It is.
Sorry.
And then Nicole, do you want to go ahead with your jellyfish?
Yeah, but I was just going to make one quick comment that I think is so interesting, because I've never thought about the microbiome of a mealworm and how incredible and diverse that is and important for breaking down plastics until I heard about your research, of course.
Yeah, it was definitely a classic story of the places you'll go in grad school, doing these lit reviews of starting out with this lofty goal of understanding and fixing plastic pollution in the ocean, and then reading papers from the 1960s on the gut microbiome of various insects, and you're just how did I get here? What were all the chains of events that got me here?
One thing I wanted to know is, how do you so in my understanding, a mealworm is just a tube. What aspect of the mealworm is the gut, and how do you isolate the bacteria?
So if the mealworm is a tube, it's basically the tube within the tube.
Okay.
So you can basically dissect out its the whole gut, and from there you can basically break it apart gently to get the bacteria out. That's the nice version of me sitting in lab.
Do you like physically? Okay.
Hours of my life.
Oh, wow. At least, well, you got a lot of podcasts through in lab.
Oh, I got through so many podcasts. Guys, I'm so glad we went to grad school when we did. I don't know if I could have done grad school like 10 years ago before the podcast revolution. Sidetrack.
Yeah.
Sorry. Jellyfish and Nicole's research.
Yes.
So freaking cool.
Yeah. Just listening to so many murder podcasts and stuff while you're dissecting.
Death in Ice Valley. Amazing podcast.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to check that one out.
Mm-hmm.
I had a similar experience in terms of reading very old papers from the 40s and the 60s about jellyfish anatomy and electrophysiology and interesting things like that. But my research in my PhD focused on creating bionic jellyfish by integrating these robotic systems onto live jellyfish and controlling how they swim. So it's kind of similar to how pacemakers on a heart control the frequency of the heart beating, where we're controlling the frequency of how jellyfish swim and figuring out how fast these animals can go and what are the limits that we can really push them. And the overarching idea is we want to eventually send out these bionic jellyfish in the ocean so that we can take water samples or keep track of climate change via measuring the pH of the water or the temperature or lots of things. So in the future, we'd like to integrate these sensors onto these biohybrid robotic jellyfish and send them out in the ocean. So that's the very short summary of what I do.
And it's timely as well, because I understand that jellyfish populations are thriving because of ocean acidification. Yeah, because of climate. So you have ample jellyfish to work with for that research.
Yeah, and so the idea of using jellyfish as this model organism to integrate with this robotic control is that jellyfish are ubiquitous, like you said. They're found in all of these different types of waters and down to thousands of meters below depth in the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest trench in the world. And so because these jellyfish are so populous and they're very, very energy efficient, we can create even more energy efficient robots by just taking advantage of the live jellyfish and instead being able to control how they naturally swim. And so we can imagine that these bionic jellyfish leave more natural wakes in the water, so we can send them down to more environmentally sensitive areas of the ocean, like near coral reefs or in small crevices where these traditional robots can't necessarily reach. And so I do see this really nice feature where we're combining these new biohybrid and bio-inspired tools with traditional autonomous underwater vehicles and remotely operated vehicles, so that we can use everything in our power to figure out what's going on in the ocean, how are we contributing to climate change, and how can we fix this?
Awesome.
I feel like that's so cool because, we know so little about the ocean environment. It's dumbfounding to me sometimes to imagine how much change we've caused to this environment we still know so little about. There's all these comparisons to we know more about the moon, or we know more about Mars than we do the ocean. And I think it's always hard because you don't know what you don't know. But it is still shocking to me just how much there remains to be discovered and how hard it is to do that with our the current suite of tools we have available. It's so cool to be taking advantage of things already out there able to do this, to be able to help us learn more.
Nicely put. Love that. You're helping me.
Is there any push? Because I know a big issue is that you can't get these things, you can't get traditional robots next to animals, right? Because they run away. Is there a push to try to use these types of bio-inspired or bio-augmented robots to try to observe populations of animals and things in the ocean too?
There has been a push to use more bio-inspired traditional soft robots. So fish-like robots have been able to approach these sensitive areas where there are coral reefs and other fish, and the other animals don't seem to be freaked out by these robotic constructs. I have tested out these jellyfish in the ocean, and the surrounding fish and other jellyfish seem to be okay. But again, we haven't done conclusive evidence to support that the fish aren't stressed out and secreting stress stuff. But yeah, that is a big area of research right now.
That's interesting. And so I wanted to get into my favorite question for this interview, which is, what misconceptions of graduate school do you want to dispel? And Anja, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think a big one that probably both Nicole and I could speak to is that, like, kind of what Nicole was alluding to earlier with like the Stanford versus Caltech difference, as well as that, like, you don't need to lock yourself in a lab and only think about research and grad school to like do grad school or be good at grad school. There's a lot more to both that like time in your life that you like can and should take advantage of. Because it's also just, it's 5 years. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You can't just lock yourself in a lab and think you're going to get through it.
Exactly.
But there's also so much more that like you can and should be learning during that time to advance whatever career you want to have. So I think a really big one that both Nicole and I took advantage of and, could both speak to is communication skills. Like so much of science is like you do the science and then you spend at least as long writing about the science and talking about the science and presenting on the science. No matter how cool your science is, if you can't convey it to others, it's not going to be high impact. It's not going to get taken up and used in policy or used by other scientists. So just being able to, I think everyone thinks of grad school and like, I need to go learn stats and math and all these like novel methods, but you also need to, brush up on your public speaking skills to go to conferences or be able to, speak clearly and present your work at a lab meeting. And you need to work on, technical writing and, how you can write for a scientific audience versus how you write for, a lay audience. I think both sides of that are really important.
And also knowing context, understanding who your audience is, even within the scientific community. Yes. It's important to know who you're writing for and how you need to change your writing so that they can understand or appreciate what you have to say. And like Bill, my advisor, William Mitch, he has to do this all the time because his research is in so many different areas: electrolysis, disinfection byproducts, food disinfection byproducts, anemones, and it just goes on. And when he's applying for grants, he has to like, oh, what are they going to know?
No, I didn't do this a ton in my personal research. I think I could have done it more, and there's like tons of people who do this more and like can and should do this more in the future, but it's like talking to policymakers when your research is policy adjacent or could be policy applicable. And in the position I'm in now, I do get to have some of those meetings with scientists, and I can say, like, as the scientist in the room, like, some people come in and are showing, crazy graphs and plots that take me like 60 seconds to just wrap my head around the axis. It's like, I have a PhD, not in this field, but like in a science field, and it takes me a while. You are speaking to 3 of my policymaking colleagues who don't have that. And like, you could be telling us the most important solution for climate change possible, and we couldn't use that information because of how it's conveyed. So really figuring out how to, tailor that is so important. I think especially in like a lot of the environmental field, where so much of our research can and should be applicable to, other systems.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you said environmental field, because even in environmental engineering, it's so broad. Like even in our department, microbiology, Luthi with his like environmental contaminants, and then Bill with his water disinfection and environmental organic chemistry.
With WASH and sanitation,
exactly.
and conducting surveys on humans and stuff. Like,
exactly.
How are we all in the same department?
Exactly. Exactly. And so, Nicole, do you want to also contribute some of your misconceptions you'd like to dispel? Oh no, Nicole. Oh yeah, she's back.
Yeah, sorry. My internet connection was unstable for a while. Okay. Am I still unstable?
No, you're
good. You're good.
We have you. Isn't it amazing that like we're literally a year in?
Yes.
Can't do this.
Yes. I don't know. I actually love when she's coming. She's gonna come back. I love when stuff like this happen, because it's like a record of the time.
Yes.
And it is what it is. We just have to get used to it. I hope she comes back.
4 months in, we're like, this is not fun anymore.
Yes.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. My internet connection was unstable, which is the pitfall of Zoom meetings now.
It is what it is.
Yeah, but adding on to the great conversation that we were having before, the only thing that I really want to add is that this is especially important when you're doing interdisciplinary research, which is what you guys were touching on in the end, that environmental engineering is such a big field. And, for me in bioengineering, I was working in a mechanical engineering / civil and environmental engineering lab. And so I was communicating with people with backgrounds in robotics and organismal biology. And so really knowing your audience and knowing how to communicate with them is so important. As well as, having public conversations with media and kids, from, elementary school kids to middle school and high school and college, where you really need to think carefully about what your audience knows so that you can communicate with them in a really productive way, as opposed to just talking at them and no one understands, but no one wants to say that they don't understand. Yeah.
I completely agree. That brings me back to my first couple of years, or first year in the PhD, where like I'd have to put on my poker face in group meeting, like, yes, completely understand what you're saying. I don't know. Yeah.
And a lot of the times now we know it's not necessarily our fault as the audience. Like you as the speaker should have thought about this enough to create a cohesive, understandable presentation.
Completely agree.
Yeah, it's a two-way street.
I feel like that's like kind of gets back to your original question here of like misconceptions, kind of about grad school, but just like maybe more broadly about like getting a degree in science. It's like you're supposed to come out of it like knowing everything and being this big expert. And I obviously know a lot about the thing I know a lot about. But I think if anything, it just shows you how much you don't know. And I think it gave me a lot of confidence moving into a slightly different field afterwards, of just saying like, I don't know what you're talking about. And like, I'm pretty sure you didn't tell me what you were like, right? Like it gave me that confidence of being able to say like, I'm a pretty smart person and I don't know what's happening right now. So I think we need to like dial it back a little bit, or just like ask those questions that are perceived as dumb, because other people are probably thinking it the same way, thinking about the same question. And I feel like I just like, I feel more confident. I feel more confident like asking those types of questions now, because I know that like, if I don't know, I can't help. So might as well tell me.
And I also wanted to add, just asking practical questions. A lot of times, I know Bill will say when he's reviewing a paper with some really cool science, but I mean, this will never become implemented because it's just not practical. You're running this process at a pH of 0.
Everything dies on contact.
Exactly. Like we're not going to be doing this. So it's not, I mean, nice paper, but
Well, and I also think that like, it also gets to this just kind of general development of like critical thinking skills and being able to ask that question that's, much broader than just like the area you researched in, or just like, I can now feel pretty good about going to pretty much any number of my meetings or like scientific talks or reading papers outside my field, and just be able to like think of a question, and like engage in that conversation, or, this seems really interesting. What about XYZ? Or, like just being able to like kind of pull apart the facade a tiny bit of like science, but also being able to do that to like the news or, general scientific hot takes that you see online and stuff, and just being able to like, interesting, take a step back, do a gut check, do like 2 seconds of research, and you're like, okay, interesting. Like I now get this a little bit more and like understand where they're coming up with this like, clickbaity headline and how misleading that is. And I think
which is often just a journalist trying to get people to read their article, but So I wanted to ask one more question for both of you too. This just came up in my mind to chime in on before we, end our discussion. What do you think that, especially now because of COVID-19, the pandemic, do you think that as scientists, maybe we are at fault for this, or maybe the news media is at fault? Do you think that we portray ourselves as knowing the final answer too often, and not what we actually do is that we have like a collective understanding of what's going on that changes, and then we reach another collective agreement going forward? And I don't think many people understand that that's the process, and that we're not necessarily looking for truth, we're just looking for consensus. So what do you think about that in terms of how science has been portrayed in the media? Is it our fault, or is it
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that goes back all the way to when we were kids and learning about science in elementary school, because we're given these giant textbooks and told this is the truth. If you want to be good at science, you need to memorize this book, and it's not about the critical thinking, and you're not taught to analyze everything. And I know that those are complicated concepts for kids, but at least there needs to be this broad concept of science is constantly changing, and so we can see that the data, the data is the data, but the data analysis can be very different, and so you can draw different conclusions from the same absolute numbers. So I think that's something that really needs to change from a very basic point of view in education.
Yeah, teaching that science is the process by which you get to an answer, rather than, it's not to insult the field of mathematics, but it's not a math problem, right? There's not always a right answer. It's like process of discovery. I also think more broadly, especially, with the pandemic and other like really big questions of science facing our society, that a lot of it comes down to how the media is designed to engage. And, old school media practices of needing to tell both sides of a story and treating both of them very equally. And like totally understand that is like a format for good constructive journalism in some cases. But, when you treat the pandemic and vaccinations or climate change, like there's two sides of a story and you give them both weight to an uninformed public, that does show that like, oh, maybe it is open for debate. When really it's 999,000 scientists over here saying climate change is very real, very happening. And, a few people who have been like expelled from the scientific consensus and community saying, no, it's not. And like, I don't know. I'm really curious and like want to learn more about like how we as scientists can engage with media and have that discussion. Because there's like, I've done some work, and Nicole has as well, of like engaging with media on our research and, like reporting out our science. But I don't know how you kind of get into the like systematic issues of how we conduct journalism, especially on some of these like really big issues. Like, oh, they said the vaccine was effective, but now it might not be effective here. And you're like, those can both, like, we can hold all of that at the same time and build a story around that, rather than like pitting these two things against each other as if it like has to be an A or B.
Yeah, I just think it's maybe having more scientists get into journalism as a career. I really love ABC News has Dr. Jen Ashton as like a permanent voice on their channel, and I really love how she treats the science and really tries to get people to understand like margins of error and all of these stuff. But I think maybe just having more permanent scientists, not necessarily in the medical field. I mean, of course, we have, we're humans, so we need to look out for our own health. But, having permanent scientists just explain the scientific process over and over and over again will even change how the media portrays the scientific story.
And it goes back to Nicole's point of like, if even the average media journalist was taught better about science as a kid and, taught more about the process and just like, oh, XYZ made this discovery, but this is how they got there, then, maybe they would hold on to that a little bit better and down the line in their career.
Completely
Which
agree.
Is, what's interesting. So when I was in high school, I did high school journalism. But even before that, I remember being in elementary school and, writing research papers, and the teachers would explicitly tell us, make sure to check where your sources are coming from. So if it's from the encyclopedia, that's probably a good source. If it's just on Wikipedia, anyone can edit that. And so I don't really know where that information has gone, because it seems like no one really cares about that anymore. And we're just using these unreliable sources. And so, I think that's a really good point of making sure that we tell multiple sides of the story, but not necessarily giving them equal weight if they don't deserve that equal weight from the beginning.
Exactly. I actually think this is there's a bit of a generational divide on that, because like when you, and it always happens to people of our older generation that's not really accustomed to dealing with validity and reliability. But I also see millennials citing some sources that are not
just because it's on the internet doesn't mean just because it's on the internet and not Wikipedia does not mean like inherently a good source.
Exactly. Or like the information that they say might be true, but it's it's out of context. Like, silica is maybe a carcinogen when you inhale it, but not when you consume it in some cases. So, yeah.
And I think it also does come back. Like, I think as scientists, we can also do a better job with how we talk about things, right? Like, margins of error are really hard for people to understand as like a plus or minus 5%, that kind of thing. And so if we can find ways that like we as a collective can talk about error and reproducibility and, the whole like process of science moving towards a collective truth and a collective consensus, like we can talk about it more as that and less as like, here's this number I found plus or minus XYZ. I think that does make it a little bit easier for outside players to like understand, hopefully.
Yeah, completely agree. And so that this was an hour. Thank you so much for contributing to this episode. I think both of you provided some really useful information and really helped me because y'all took like control.
It reminds me of all those times we would have lunch in the kitchen. And just the three of us would go on rants about like what's wrong with society and everything that's happening in the world.
I miss those in the kitchen.
I know, microwaving tea.
Yeah. Well, until next time.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. So thank you and bye.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you for watching this interview/discussion with Dr. Anja Brandon and Dr. Nicole Xu. Please like and subscribe to the channel because that helps me, lets me know that I'm doing something good. And stay tuned for next week.